The real origin of the Black Death. Uncovered by ancient DNA, for centuries the Black Death has been one of history's greatest mysteries. Between 1347 and 1351, it swept across Europe, Asia and North Africa, killing an estimated 50 million people, nearly half of Europe's population at the time. Entire villages vanished, cities fell silent, families were erased overnight, and for generations, historians and scientists have tried to answer the same haunting question. Where did it all begin? The story of the Black Death usually starts in Europe, but its roots go far deeper, into remote landscapes and ancient trade routes. For years, the origin theories were countless. Some claimed it began in China in the early 14th century, travelling west along the Silk Road. Others believed it emerged from the steppes of Central Asia. There were even theories that blamed strange cosmic events or divine punishment. But the truth, as we now know, comes from a surprising source: ancient human teeth. In 2022, an international team of researchers analysed DNA from the teeth of people buried in medieval cemeteries in Kyrgyzstan, a mountainous region in Central Asia. The graves were dated to the years 1338 and 1339, just a few years before the Black Death exploded across Europe. The tombstones carried inscriptions in Syriac, noting that the dead had died from pestilence. But this was no ordinary sickness. When scientists extracted DNA from these centuries-old teeth, they found something extraordinary: the genetic fingerprints of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. Even more astonishingly, the strain they found was the direct ancestor of all the plague bacteria that would later devastate Europe and beyond. In other words, these small graves in Kyrgyzstan marked the very beginning of the deadliest pandemic in recorded history. But how did a microscopic killer hidden in a remote part of Central Asia transform into a catastrophe that reshaped the world? To answer that, we have to step back in time to the trade networks of the 14th century. During the Middle Ages, the Silk Road wasn't just a route for silk and spices. It was a living artery, carrying goods, ideas, and unfortunately, diseases. Merchants, travellers, and soldiers moved constantly between the East and West, linking continents. Along with precious cargo came rats, and on those rats were fleas carrying Yersinia pestis. Once the plague bacterium entered a human population, it spread with terrifying speed. The likely scenario is this: the ancestral plague strain from Kyrgyzstan began circulating in local rodent populations. Through trade caravans and human movement, it slowly travelled westward. By 1346, it reached the Crimean port city of Kaffa, where it erupted in a brutal siege between the Mongol army and Genoese merchants. Historical accounts claim that the besieging forces, stricken with plague, catapulted the bodies of their dead over the city walls, an early form of biological warfare. From Kaffa, fleeing ships carried the plague across the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean, and then into every corner of Europe. Once in Europe, the Black Death spread like wildfire. Without knowledge of germs or hygiene, medieval cities were perfect breeding grounds for disease. Crowded streets, poor sanitation, and constant human contact meant that once the plague entered a community, death followed swiftly. Victims often developed fever, chills, vomiting, and painful swellings called buboes. In many cases, death came within days. The psychological impact was as devastating as the disease itself. People abandoned their sick family members. Entire communities turned to superstition, flagellation, and religious extremism in a desperate search for answers. Some blamed foreigners, minorities, or witches, leading to horrific acts of persecution. The fabric of society itself began to unravel. The Black Death didn't just kill, it transformed history. Labour shortages empowered peasants to demand better wages. The feudal system began to weaken. Religious and political structures were shaken. In some regions, entire towns were abandoned and never rebuilt. Art and literature became obsessed with themes of death and decay, giving rise to the macabre imagery we still recognize today. But for centuries, the exact starting point of this catastrophe remained elusive. The breakthrough in Kyrgyzstan changed everything. The ancient DNA showed that the strain from 1338 was what scientists call the most recent common ancestor of all later plague strains. This means that every single outbreak that followed, from the medieval pandemic to later epidemics, can be traced back to this single genetic branch. Even more fascinating is how the plague survived for centuries after the Black Death ended. Instead of disappearing, Yersinia pestis found safe havens in wild rodent populations. In certain parts of the world, these bacteria remain alive today, occasionally causing small outbreaks when humans come into contact with infected animals. So, what made the 14th century such a perfect storm for the plague? Part of the answer lies in climate and environment. Historical climate data suggests that Central Asia experienced wetter conditions in the years before the outbreak. This may have boosted rodent populations, increasing contact between infected animals and humans. Combined with the growing trade networks of the era, the conditions were ideal for a pandemic. Today, the story of the Black Death is more than just a tale of tragedy. It's a reminder of how interconnected our world has always been, and how a single microscopic organism can alter the course of history. The same global networks that bring wealth and culture can also carry unimaginable danger. In a way, the world of the 14th century isn't so different from ours. The ancient graves in Kyrgyzstan are quiet now. The people buried there never knew they would become the starting point of a global disaster. They lived their lives, traded goods, told stories, loved and lost, just like us. And yet, from their teeth, centuries later, came the answer to one of history's most haunting mysteries. The Black Death began here, in a small community along the Silk Road, carried by the invisible hand of bacteria and the unstoppable force of human connection. And while science has finally traced its origin, the lessons it teaches us are timeless. That our world is fragile, our connections are both our strength and our vulnerability, and that history's greatest disasters often start in places no one would ever expect.